Footnote 174 explains the term commander, originally a Cossack title, which here refers to military officers who held authority over occupied towns, illustrating the complex and often tense relations between Jewish communities and the shifting political powers of Eastern Europe. The footnotes also trace the genealogy of Jewish mystical and literary traditions. Footnote 178, for example, refers to Bir HaGolah, Well of the Exiles, written by Moses Rivks, a Jewish chronicler who fled Vilna during the massacre of 1655, and Magen Abraham, Shield of Abraham, written by Abel Gumbeiner, Rosh Yeshiva, or head of a Jewish academy in Kalish, whose parents had perished during times of unrest. These works document centuries of Jewish thought, struggle, and resilience, linking the mystical with the historical and the personal with the communal. Other notes clarify foundational aspects of Jewish religious scholarship. Footnote 179 reminds the reader of the Tanaim, the rabbinic authorities active before 200 Common Era, and the Amoraim, who followed them until the conclusion of the Talmud around 500 Common Era. Footnote 180 traces the author of Tzima David Gans, who died in 1613, and whose chronicle, Branch of David, preserved valuable historical and genealogical material. Footnote 181 explains the Hebrew term for ethical instruction, showing how moral guidance was embedded in daily Jewish life, not merely through law, but through constant teaching and reflection. Some notes reference specific texts of ethical or mystical literature, often tied to particular towns or authors, such as Amud Shiv Ahar 7 Pillars, by Bezalel of Kobrin in 1666, Mor HaKatan, The Lesser Light, by Meir of Tarnopol in 1697, and Nethib HaYasher, The Right Path, by Naphtali of Minsk in 1712. These works were part of a vibrant intellectual culture, circulating among students, scholars, and mystics, preserving the ethical and spiritual heritage of Eastern European Jewry. Other footnotes clarify geographical and mystical references. Zamość, in footnote 187, was a town in the Lublin region of Poland, while footnote 197 refers to Terra Doromum, the legendary dwelling place of the Messiah, drawn from Talmudic and Kabbalistic traditions. Footnote 198 explains the term Baal Shem, or Master of the Name, referring to a person believed to have the power to perform miracles through the sacred name of God. Footnotes 199 and 200 give the titles of early Hasidic texts, including Maggid Deber Yaakov, or Likud Amrim, which preserve the sayings and teachings of Israel Baal Shem Tov and Toldoth Yaakov Yosef, the first literary exposition of Hasidic thought by Jacob Joseph Cohen. Additional notes clarify the evolution of Tzaddikic practices, such as the mystical custom of wearing white garments on Sabbaths and holidays, as noted in footnote 205, adopted for specific Kabbalistic reasons by the most devout followers of the Tzaddik. The emergence of the White Russian Hasidim, nicknamed Chabadniks, is explained in footnote 203, derived from the Hebrew acronym Hakma, Bina, ADH, meaning wisdom, understanding, knowledge, reflecting the rationalized system of Hasidism developed in the northern regions of Belarus. Finally, the footnotes chart the escalation of conflict between the Hasidim and the Orthodox rabbis, particularly under the leadership of Elijah of Vilna, noted in footnote 204 as the Jain of Vilna, whose title reflects both erudition and moral authority over the Jewish communities of Lithuania and beyond. References to the persecution of the Hasidim, the formal Hurim decrees, and the calls for ostracism provide a sobering reminder of the high stakes of religious innovation, where spiritual authority, community cohesion, and the exercise of power collided in dramatic, often violent ways. Taken together, these footnotes are far more than mere citations. They are keys to understanding a world of intellectual ferment, mystical aspiration, and human struggle. They reveal the complex interplay of tradition and innovation, fear and hope, orthodoxy and mysticism, a world in which the lives of rabbis, miracle workers, philosophers, and ordinary Jews intersected amid the political upheavals of the 18th century. They remind the listener that every ritual, every book, every gesture, and every mystical saying carried layers of meaning, consequence, and historical resonance, connecting the private life of the soul to the grand sweep of history in Poland, Lithuania, White Russia, and the broader European stage. Chapter 7. The Russian Quarantine Against Jews till 1772. Thank you. This is another discussion on history of the Jews in Russia and Poland by Simon Dubnow. Let us briefly revisit chapters 1 through 6 before moving forward. From the earliest settlements, Jewish communities established themselves in Eastern Europe, navigating the uncertainties of shifting rulers while maintaining their traditions. Elders and communal courts guided daily life, ensuring that law, custom, and faith endured even amid change. Scholarship and learning became central, with Torah study and rabbinic teachings shaping both minds and communal identity. Yet life was fraught with challenges. Persecutions, legal restrictions, and expulsions tested the resilience of these communities, compelling them to adapt through trade, crafts, and economic skill, all while maintaining connections with the surrounding populations. Internal conflicts also emerged, as traditionalists and reformers debated the right path, and external political pressures influenced communal governance. Through triumphs and trials, the Jewish people remained steadfast, rooted in heritage yet responsive to the world around them. Now, as we turn to Chapter 7, our focus shifts to the growing tension between the Hasidic movement and established rabbinic authorities. Under the leadership of Elijah of Vilna, the Vilna Jain, we see the clash between mystical devotion and traditional scholarship, a struggle that would profoundly shape Jewish communal life in Eastern Europe. The Empire of Muscovy, stretching across the vast forests and rivers of northeastern Europe and cut off from the bustling cultures of Western Europe by what was often imagined as an impenetrable barrier, a wall of Chinese, or, more accurately, Byzantine influence, held during the 16th century a deep and enduring prejudice against the Jewish people. This prejudice was not a casual sentiment. It was rooted in centuries of suspicion, woven into the fabric of Muscovite society. The Russian people of that era, steeped in the traditions of Tataric and Byzantine cultural influences, regarded foreigners, people they called infidels, with a wary eye, and the Jews, in particular, were the objects of fear and suspicion. Yet there was more at play than mere xenophobia. The Muscovites still remembered vividly the Judaizing heresy, a religious upheaval that had struck terror into their hearts at the close of the 15th century and the dawn of the 16th. To the people of Muscovy, the Jews were not simply outsiders. They were seen as dangerous magicians and seducers, capable of corruption and deceit. Rumors, superstitious and persistent, ascribed to them every conceivable crime and mischief. In the year 1526, the ambassador of Grand Duke Vasily III, known in Western chronicles as Basil III, while stationed in Rome, confided to the renowned Italian scholar Paolo Giovio that the Muscovite people feared no one as much as they feared the Jews, and that their borders were closed to these strangers. The fear of Jewish influence was so ingrained that even Jewish merchants from neighboring Poland and Lithuania, who occasionally came to trade in border cities, such as Smolensk, were never permitted permanent residence. Their daring to bring their goods into the capital city of Moscow itself was a dangerous gamble. Around the year 1545, the goods of Jewish merchants arriving from Brest-Litovsk were burned in Moscow. The Muscovite authorities used this incident to protest to the Polish government, claiming that these merchants had introduced forbidden merchandise, although the Jews themselves had no lawful right to enter the Russian lands. The matter escalated in 1550, when the Polish king Sigismund Augustus, seeking to protect his Jewish subjects engaged in trade, sent a formal charter to Tsar Ivan IV, known in history as Ivan the Terrible. He demanded that Lithuanian Jews be allowed to enter Russia for commercial purposes, invoking the old treaties that had bound Poland and Muscovy. Ivan IV responded with an unflinching rejection. In words that were resolute and severe, he declared that it was not convenient to allow Jews into Russia, for their presence brought many evils. He accused them of importing poisonous herbs or medicines into the Russian realm and of leading the faithful Muscovites away from Christianity. The Tsar instructed the Polish king that he should no longer petition on behalf of these Jews. Yet Ivan IV was not content to leave his intolerance as mere words. In 1563, when Russian troops captured the Polish border city of Polotsk, the Tsar commanded that all local Jews either convert to the Greek Orthodox faith or face death. Those who refused baptism were drowned in the icy waters of the Dubnow River. Ivan's harshness toward the Poles, by contrast, was tempered. He took captives and destroyed churches, but he did not pursue the wholesale conversion or execution that he demanded of the Jews. Only in 1579, through the courage and strategic skill of Stephen Batory, king of Poland and protector of his Jewish subjects, was Polotsk restored to Polish rule. This rigid, denominational approach to politics remained a hallmark of Muscovy for decades. Despite the prohibitions, Jews from Poland and Lithuania found ways, often illicit, to enter Moscow in pursuit of their mercantile endeavors. During the chaotic period of unrest, a time when Muscovy was riven by political disorder and the throne stood vacant before the establishment of the Romanov dynasty in 1513, Polish influence surged in the capital. With them came a number of Jewish merchants, whose presence stirred alarm and deep anxiety among the Muscovite nobility. In 1510, as the noblemen of Moscow negotiated with Poland over the potential election of the Polish crown Prince Vladislav to the Russian throne, they codified their fears in a formal agreement of 20 clauses. The fourth clause was particularly strict. It forbade the establishment of churches or temples of the Latin faith or any religion other than the Greek Orthodox. It prohibited any person from being persuaded to adopt Roman Catholicism or any foreign faith, and it explicitly barred Jews from entering Muscovy, whether for business or any other purpose. In this manner, the Jews were systematically denied the opportunity to cultivate commercial or civic life within the Russian Empire. Yet history would move on relentlessly. 40 years after these prohibitions, the same empire of Muscovy would expand into the territories of Poland and Lithuania, regions heavily populated by Jewish communities. In these lands, the policies and attitudes cultivated in Moscow were destined to encounter new challenges and to display, in time, a peculiar form of bureaucratic and political creativity in the handling of the so-called Jewish question. In the year 1654, the Muscovite Empire, under the rule of Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich, extended its dominion into the province of Little Russia, a fertile region that roughly corresponds to parts of modern-day Ukraine. This expansion marked the first substantial encounter between the Muscovite state and large Jewish populations, a people whose presence had been largely unknown to the Orthodox Russian heartland. As Russian soldiers, allied with the fierce Cossacks, semi-military communities of the steppes famed for their horsemanship and ruthless raids, swept across White Russia, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and a vast expanse of the Ukraine, they encountered cities unlike anything they had imagined. Entire neighborhoods were inhabited by Jews, a community that to the Muscovites, who remained deeply ignorant of them, seemed almost mythical. The common knowledge among the Muscovite faithful was grim and unyielding. Centuries earlier, the Jews had been accused of crucifying Christ. For this reason, the devout Orthodox Russians had been forbidden from allowing Jewish travelers or settlers into the sacred lands of Muscovy. Yet in these newly conquered territories, the Muscovite rulers acted with the arrogance and authority of occupiers, imposing their will upon the local populations in a manner both brutal and indiscriminate. In the cities of Vilna, known today as Vilnius and Mogilev, the soldiers and their commanders perpetrated massacres, murdering Jewish men, women, and children, while the survivors were expelled from their homes. In the city of Vitebsk, Jews were captured and held as prisoners of war. Elsewhere, Jewish communities were assaulted, their property plundered, their lives thrown into chaos. From this violent upheaval arose a Jewish population within the Muscovite Empire that was as unexpected as it was diverse. It consisted largely of prisoners of war, forcibly removed from border towns in the government of Mogilev and sent deep into central Russia, some even to the remote reaches of Siberia, a land of ice, forests, and exile. In one of the earliest diplomatic resolutions between Russia and Poland, the Peace of Andrusovo, signed in 1667, the prisoners of war from both nations were granted freedom. The Jewish captives, however, were permitted to remain in Muscovy, where they formed the fragile beginnings of a small Jewish colony in Moscow. Over the decades, this colony grew slowly, occasionally including converts from the Christian faith, and became a focal point for other Jews from neighboring regions, who, despite official prohibitions, sought entry into the capital. A handful of Jewish merchants, particularly those involved in the cloth trade, were able to obtain a special permit known as a red ticket, allowing them to visit Moscow officially. Yet, the prohibition against Jewish residency in the capital was reinstated in 1676. Outside Moscow, small groups of Jews persisted in the newly annexed Russian provinces of Chernihiv and Poltava, and parts of the province of Kiev, areas that had survived the deadly Cossack uprisings of 1648. From the Polish-controlled Ukraine, some Jewish merchants occasionally ventured into these Russian-held districts on business, despite Russian laws forbidding permanent settlement. When Peter the Great, the Tsar of former, ascended to the throne at the close of the 17th century, there was hope that his sweeping efforts to modernize and Europeanize Russia would bring a more enlightened attitude toward foreigners, including Jews. Peter, known for breaking windows into the wider world of Europe and importing knowledge, technologies, and ideas, nevertheless maintained the restrictions against Jewish settlement. Contemporary accounts reveal that in 1698, while visiting Holland, Peter met with the Jewish community of Amsterdam. They petitioned the burgomaster, a municipal leader named Whitsun, to intercede on their behalf, requesting that their co-religionists be allowed to settle in Russia. Peter listened carefully, and though he expressed gratitude for their advice and recognized the potential benefits of Jewish skills in commerce, he responded with caution. He feared that the deeply ingrained prejudices and superstitions of the Russian populace, who regarded Jews as almost monstrous infidels and Christ killers, would make peaceful integration impossible. Even setting aside the anecdotal details, it is clear that Peter regarded the mass settlement of Jews among the Muscovite population as potentially hazardous. He may also have been influenced by lingering personal and cultural biases, which, while not strictly religious, reflected the entrenched suspicion and hostility toward Jews that permeated Russian society at the time. The reforms that reshaped Russia's military, economy, and court did not dismantle centuries of prejudice, leaving the Jewish population in a state of cautious and precarious survival within the empire. Peter the Great, the towering figure of Russia's transformation, was a man who sought to drag his vast empire into the modern age by opening its doors to the skilled and the ambitious from across Europe. He invited artisans, engineers, shipbuilders, and military experts from distant lands, embracing the talents of foreigners as tools of progress. Yet in this grand experiment of modernization, there was one people for whom he made a permanent exception. As the Russian historian Sergei Solovyov would later record, Peter would openly declare that he preferred to see nations professing Islam or even pagan beliefs rather than the Jews. In his own blunt words, he called them rogues and cheats, insisting that his aim was to eradicate evil, not to multiply it, no matter how much they might plead or bribe those close to him. He insisted that Jews should neither live nor trade within Russia. This stance, harsh and intolerant, was not born of reasoned economic critique, but of prejudice. For a ruler to view Jewish commerce as uniquely deceitful was to ignore the very nature of the wider Russian merchant class, which had long been guided by a cynical and widely accepted proverb: if you do not cheat, you do not sell. In other words, cheating was not seen as a Jewish vice alone, but as an ingrained feature of the broader commercial culture. Yet Peter, perhaps influenced by deep-seated anti-Semitic bias, singled out the Jews as the embodiment of fraud. There were other forces at work as well. forces of rumor and fear. In the year 1702, disturbing reports reached Moscow from Little Russia, the region that today lies largely in Ukraine. In the town of Gorodnya, near the ancient city of Chernigov, it was said that Jews had tortured a Christian to death and sent his blood to other Jews in the region. This chilling accusation echoed a more widespread and sinister myth that had become fashionable in Poland at the time: the charge of ritual murder. The descendants of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack leader whose uprising had devastated Jewish communities in the mid-17th century, had apparently carried this rumor into Russia. Such dark and unverified tales could easily poison the mind of a ruler, and they may have deepened Peter's distrust and hostility toward Jews. Yet, history is rarely one-sided. During the Russo-Swedish War, when the Russian army moved along the Polish border regions inhabited by Jews, Peter did not repeat the brutal pogroms that had been carried out by his father, Tsar Alexis Mihailovich. In the late summer of 1708, just before the famous battle at Lesnaya in White Russia, a riot broke out in the town of Mstislavl. Soldiers and bandits attacked Jewish residents, threatening bloodshed. But the account of what followed is preserved in a brief entry in a local Jewish community record book, known as a Kahal Journal or Pinks. In that record, dated the 28th day of Elul in the Jewish year 5468, the Jews wrote of the arrival of the Caesar, the ruler of Muscovy, named Peter, son of Alexis, who came with a vast host. They described how robbers and murderers among his people attacked them without his knowledge. The situation nearly erupted into violence. But the entry says God moved Peter to enter their synagogue himself. His personal presence prevented a massacre. The Tsar then ordered that 13 of the rioters be hanged immediately, and peace returned to the land. In this moment, the same ruler who spoke of Jews as rogues became, briefly, their protector. As Peter's reign drew to a close, he began to admit Jewish financial agents into his new capital, St. Petersburg, the city he had founded on the Baltic coast to be Russia's window to Europe. One of the most energetic of these agents was Lipman Levy, a banker from the region of Courland, known today as part of Latvia. Levy would later become one of the most prominent court Jews, a term used for Jewish financiers who serve European monarchs and aristocrats by managing loans and state finances. His influence would grow even more under Peter's successors. But after Peter's death, the brief protection afforded to Jews under his rule began to crumble. His immediate successors shifted from a defensive stance to a more aggressive policy. The powerful magnates at court, who governed Russia under the name of the Supreme Secret Council, began to worry about the presence of a Jewish community near the empire's heart. They targeted the Jewish colony in Smolensk, a border district adjoining Poland. Smolensk was home to a group of white Russian Jews who earned their living through a lucrative trade of the era, leasing excise and customs duties. In other words, they paid the state for the right to collect taxes on goods, a system that could be extremely profitable. One such tax farmer, Borik Lebov, the son of Leib, even dared to build a synagogue in the village of Zvirovich for the small Jewish population there. This act, meant as a humble religious provision, sparked outrage. A local Greek Orthodox priest, fearing that a synagogue would lure his parishioners away from the church and into Judaism, raised the alarm. The villagers, inflamed by his panic, began to bombard St. Petersburg with protests. The elders of the Holy Synod, the highest governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church, were alarmed. The old fear of Judaizing heresy, the idea that Jews might convert Christians through persuasion or deceit, once again haunted their minds. In March of 1727, Empress Catherine I issued a decree, known as an ukase, through the Supreme Secret Council. The order demanded that Borik and his associates be removed from their positions in the excise and customs service and deported immediately from Russia beyond the border. This was a decisive and humiliating blow. A month later, another ukase was issued, this one even harsher. It affected all Jews in the border provinces, especially those living in Little Russia. The decree ordered that Jews, both men and women, who had settled in the Ukraine and other Russian cities, be expelled immediately beyond Russia's borders, and that no Jews be allowed to enter Russia under any circumstances. They were to be strictly warned in every place. The exiles were also forbidden from carrying gold or silver coins into the Polish dominions. They were ordered to exchange such coins for copper money before leaving. This brutal decree did more than punish individuals. It violated the ancient rights of the Jews who had remained in Little Russia after its annexation by Muscovy, and it ignored the autonomy of the region and its elective leaders, the hetmans. These hetmans, the elected military and political chiefs of the Cossack territories, traditionally had the authority to handle such matters. Yet the imperial decree overrode them, crushing local self-rule in favor of centralized power. In this way, the story of the Jews under Peter the Great and his successors becomes a drama of contradiction. A ruler who both condemned and protected, a society that feared and depended on the very people it sought to expel, and an empire whose march toward modernity was shadowed by ancient prejudices. The capriciousness of the Central Russian government had sparked a wave of protest among the Little Russian Cossacks, fierce warriors and stewards of the Dnieper lands, who were themselves far from friendly toward Jewish communities. Yet, even these proud defenders of the borderlands found themselves compelled to intervene. In the name of the Zaporozhian army on both sides of the Dnieper, Hetman Daniel Apostle, a leader of great influence in Little Russia, drafted a petition to the imperial authorities in St. Petersburg. He pleaded for the allowance of traveling Jewish salesmen to attend the fairs scattered across the fertile plains of Little Russia, arguing that their commercial activity was too valuable to be denied. The imperial response came in the form of an official ukase, a decree from the highest authority, issued in the year of 1728 by the Supreme Secret Council in the name of Emperor Peter II. The young emperor, a minor, lent his name to this carefully worded concession, which balanced imperial authority with local economic necessity. One of its clauses read as follows: the Jews were permitted to visit the fairs of Little Russia, but only temporarily and strictly for commercial purposes. They were allowed to sell goods wholesale, measured by standard units such as ells and pounds, but retail trade was forbidden. All proceeds from these sales had to remain within Little Russia to buy other merchandise. Exporting gold or silver was strictly prohibited. Permanent residence, following the ukase of the previous year, 1727, remained forbidden. Thus, those Jews who had been forcibly expelled from the region were now graciously allowed temporary access to trade, though even this permission was tightly constrained. They were not to conduct retail business, could not carry their earnings out of the country, and were bound to operate only within the narrow scope of wholesale commerce. The spirit of generosity in this concession barely concealed the lingering resentment and suspicion toward Jewish merchants. By the year 1731, this act of controlled leniency was extended to the government of Smolensk, a region on the western edge of the Russian Empire. Only 3 years later, local officials in the Sloboda border province, which corresponds roughly to modern-day Kharkov, petitioned the Russian authorities for an even greater concession. They requested that Jewish merchants be permitted to trade not only wholesale, but also retail, by the same measurements of ells and pounds, citing the lack of competent business people in the Sloboda regiments and the resulting insufficiency of local trade. Empress Anna of Russia, who reigned with formidable determination, granted this request in the year 1774. In that same year, the privilege was extended to the entirety of Little Russia, following petitions from its Christian inhabitants. Yet, this era of incremental toleration came to an abrupt halt. Fear and superstition, deeply rooted in Muscovite tradition, surged once more. The Russian people harbored a long-standing dread of what they considered the insidious influence of Jewish teachings, a fear that any deviation from Orthodox Christianity might corrupt the faithful. The event that triggered a wave of panic was nothing less than dramatic. Borik Lebov, a Jewish tax farmer from Smolensk, had defied the law even after being expelled, crossing the forbidden Polish-Russian frontier. During his stay in Moscow, he encountered Alexander Voznitsin, a retired naval captain with a contemplative mind prone to theological speculation. Under Leibov's guidance, Voznitsin delved into the study of the Hebrew Bible. Slowly, he became convinced that the biblical doctrine of a single God was irreconcilable with the dogmas of the Russian Orthodox Church, with its veneration of saints, its elaborate liturgy, and the cult of icons. Alexander Voznitsin, determined to embrace the principles and rituals of Judaism, journeyed to the small town of Dubrovna in the government of Mogilev, near Smolensk. There, he underwent circumcision and formally accepted the tenets of the Jewish faith. News of his conversion spread quickly, igniting horror in those who still clung to Muscovite fears of religious contamination. Both the captain and his mentor Boris Leibov were seized and transported to St. Petersburg, where they were delivered into the hands of the dreaded Chancellery for secret inquisitorial affairs, an institution charged with rooting out heresy and dissent. There, under the relentless torment of the rack, the accused were forced to confess. Voznitsin admitted openly to abandoning the Orthodox faith, embracing the Jewish law, and speaking blasphemous words against the Holy Church. Boris Leibov confessed to having seduced Voznitsin and, according to the authorities, to having influenced the local population in Smolensk toward Judaism, even insulting the Russian priest Abramius over the creation of a synagogue in the village of Zverovich. While these latter accusations were not investigated in detail, the conversion of a naval officer was considered enough to justify the harshest penalty. The inquisitorial court moved swiftly, invoking the statute of Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich, who had codified severe punishments for heresy. In the year 1738, the Imperial Senate issued a resolution commanding that both Alexander Voznitsin and Boris Leibov be executed and burned. The decree was framed as a warning, meant to prevent others from abandoning Christian law and to deter audacious Jewish teachers from leading the faithful astray. On the 15th day of July in the year 1738, the auto de fe, a public execution by fire, was carried out in St. Petersburg. The square filled with citizens, their eyes fixed on the grim spectacle, as the punishment was administered with merciless precision, an enduring testament to the volatile intersection of law, fear, and religious fervor in 18th century Russia. This single, isolated incident ignited once again the deep-seated Muscovite hatred against those they called unbaptized Jews, and it provided the authorities in St. Petersburg, the imperial capital of the Russian Empire, with ample justification to enact further measures of violence and exclusion against them. It came to the attention of the imperial officials that, despite the strict ukase of the year 1727, which had formally prohibited Jewish settlement, a considerable number of Jews were still residing in the lands known as Little Russia. Little Russia, roughly corresponding to modern-day Ukraine, had become a refuge for these Jewish communities. There, they were employed on the estates of Russian landowners, often as arrenders, farmers, or tenants managing and cultivating the land on behalf of the landlords, and as innkeepers running taverns and hostels that catered to travelers and merchants alike. Further investigation revealed that Jews traveling from the Polish-controlled regions of the Ukraine to attend local fairs frequently chose to remain permanently, integrating themselves into little Russian towns and villages. For the Muscovite authorities, this situation was intolerable. In the year 1739, the Senate of the Russian Empire, the supreme governing council responsible for advising the monarch and issuing decrees, issued a rescript ordering the expulsion of Jews from Little Russia. These Jews had come across the mighty waters of the Dnieper River from lands beyond its eastern banks, and the government was determined to remove them. The military chancellery of Little Russia, charged with the administration of the region and the maintenance of order, responded with caution. At that time, the empire was engaged in a protracted war with the Ottoman Empire, known to Europeans as Turkey. The military chancellery warned that an immediate expulsion could be perilous, as it might drive the Jewish population into espionage or collaboration with the enemy. Heeding this counsel, the Cabinet of Ministers, the central executive body of the Russian Empire, decided to postpone the expulsion until the conclusion of the war. When hostilities with the Ottoman Empire finally drew to a close, Empress Anna, sovereign of all the Russias, issued a new ukase in the year 1740, commanding the execution of the delayed expulsion. The census of Jews effected revealed a small but noticeable community, 292 men and 281 women, residing across 130 manorial estates. In total, 573 Jewish souls, eking out a precarious existence on the fringes of Russian territory, were now compelled to leave the lands that had offered them a measure of shelter. The reign of Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, from the year 1741 to the year 1761, continued this relentless policy of religious intolerance. Elizabeth, whose days alternated between elaborate church ceremonies and lavish court balls, oversaw an intensification of persecutions against those who adhered to faiths other than Greek Orthodoxy, the official religion of the Russian Empire. By the authority of the Holy Synod, the Supreme Council of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Senate, the state undertook to spread Greek Orthodox Christianity among the pagan populations of the eastern regions of the empire. Communities that had adopted Islam under the influence of Tataric incursions were compelled to pay fines if they did not convert to the religion of the state. In an effort to suppress the spread of Islamic teachings, orders were issued for the demolition of mosques in numerous villages within the Kazan and Astrakhan governorships, regions far to the southeast of Moscow, along the Volga River, and near the Caspian Sea. These demolitions, however, were halted by the fear of retaliatory action from the Ottoman Empire, for the Russian authorities were cautious to avoid giving pretext to attacks upon Christian communities living among Muslim populations in Ottoman lands, or causing their churches to suffer oppression as a consequence. The Jewish population living in the border provinces faced a dual strategy of expulsion and forced conversion. They were, in effect, driven away from one door while being pushed toward the doors of the Greek Orthodox Church with the other. Toward the end of the year 1741, Empress Elizabeth issued a particularly severe ukase, referencing the previous decree of 1727. In this decree, she asserted that Jews in the empire, and particularly in Little Russia, continued to reside there under false pretenses, engaging in business or managing inns and taverns. The empress claimed that from such people, no benefit of any kind could accrue to her loyal subjects. On the contrary, she declared these individuals, as haters of the name of our Savior Christ, could only inflict the gravest harm. Accordingly, the empress commanded, with all the authority of her crown, that from every city, village, and hamlet of both Great Russia and Little Russia, all Jews, male and female, regardless of their social standing or profession, were to be deported abroad immediately, along with all their possessions. The decree made clear that Jews could never again enter the empire for any purpose, unless they accepted the Christian faith of the Greek Orthodox persuasion. Those who were baptized would be allowed to remain within the empire, yet they would be forbidden to leave its borders. The ukase was to be widely printed and circulated throughout the empire, with the intent of instilling in the Russian populace a proper aversion to those whom the empress labeled as enemies of Christ. Yet, the imperial planners had miscalculated. The harsh order did not succeed in bringing a single Jew into the Orthodox fold. Moreover, the rationale given in the ukase that the Jewish population inflicted extreme injury upon loyal subjects failed to convince the local inhabitants. The decree had been aimed particularly at the residents of the border provinces of Little Russia and Livonia, in hopes of benefiting them by removing Jews from their midst. Instead, these inhabitants, speaking through their local representatives, declared that the supposed benefit would be disastrous, threatening to ruin the communities rather than save them. From the fertile plains of Little Russia, now part of the sprawling Russian Empire, a chorus of protest rose, not from the oppressed, but from the very officials and merchants who depended on the Jewish population for the lifeblood of commerce. Greek contractors, responsible for collecting the customs duties that funded the imperial treasury, sounded the alarm to the Senate of the Russian Empire. They argued that the harsh repression of Jews, which disrupted their business trips to Poland, had slashed state revenues by diminishing the flow of imported goods. The expulsion of these Jews, bound as they were by intricate commercial and financial ties with Christian merchants, threatened mutual ruin. To allow the Jews to retain their rights to enter Little Russia temporarily for business, they insisted, was not merely an act of tolerance. It was an economic necessity. Even louder voices arose from the northern province of Livonia, the Baltic region encompassing modern-day Latvia and Estonia, where Riga stood as a vital port city. The local gubernatorial administration and the city magistracy delivered urgent petitions to the Senate. According to an imperial ukase, or formal decree, Jews residing in Riga and its surrounding districts had been ordered to depart within 6 weeks. The administrators warned that enforcing this expulsion would devastate the imperial treasury and obliterate the mercantile class. Polish landowners, or pans, and merchants who relied on Jewish brokers in Riga would cease buying goods there and would instead import them from Germany, using expelled Jewish middlemen. Trade in Riga, they predicted, would collapse, leaving Russian merchants unable to sell the goods brought by sea. They pleaded for an exception, asking that Jews be allowed temporary admission to conduct their business, even if only for the duration of commercial fairs. Moved by these practical arguments, the Senate drafted a detailed report to Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great and ruler of Russia since 1741. The report emphasized that allowing Jews temporary residence would promote commerce, increase the revenues of the state treasury, and protect the economic interests of Christian citizens in frontier regions. It reminded her that Jews had enjoyed this limited privilege in Little Russia since 1728 under previous imperial decrees. Yet, despite the reasoned plea, Elizabeth Petrovna, steeped in the religious fanaticism of her era, remained unmoved. In December of 1743, she recorded a brief but decisive resolution on the Senate's report. From the enemies of Christ I desire neither gain nor profit. The Senate, bound by the autocratic will of the Empress, had no choice but obedience. In January of 1744, an imperial ukase was issued, commanding officials throughout Little Russia, Livonia, and other provinces to identify and expel all Jews. Only those willing to be baptized as Christians could remain. The decree was absolute. No Jews were to be admitted into Russia for any reason, not even for short-term commercial purposes, and no further petitions on their behalf were to be submitted to the Senate. The bureaucrats were required to report once the expulsion had been fully carried out. Through this act of religious zeal, Elizabeth Petrovna effectively purged the provinces of a Jewish presence that had survived for generations, even before the regions were absorbed into the Russian Empire. Contemporary historians of the time estimated that by 1753, approximately 35,000 Jews had been banished from Russian lands. Elizabeth Petrovna's fanaticism extended far beyond mass expulsions. She scrutinized her empire with the vigilance of an inquisitor, seeking even the faintest traces of Judaism. Since 1731, a distinguished physician named Antonio Sanchez had lived in the newly built capital of St. Petersburg. Sanchez was a Sephardic Marrano, a descendant of Spanish Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity, yet secretly maintained their Jewish faith. Originally invited from Holland for his exceptional medical skills, he served as the personal physician to Empress Anna Ivanovna, Elizabeth Petrovna's predecessor, and continued in this role under her reign. Beyond his duties at court, Sanchez oversaw the medical department of the Russian army and was appointed to the Academy of Sciences, where he authored influential medical treatises that gained recognition across Europe. Yet in 1749, Sanchez's career abruptly ended. He was dismissed from the Academy of Sciences and compelled to relocate to Paris. The reason, it seems, was nothing more than his steadfast devotion to Judaism. The president of the Academy, Count Kirill Razumovsky, wrote to him in sympathy, "As far as I am aware, you have not been guilty of any wrongdoing against Her Imperial Majesty or against any of her interests. But she finds it contrary to her conscience to tolerate in the Academy a man who has deserted the banner of Christ and has joined the ranks of those who fight under the banner of Moses and the Old Testament prophets. Even the illustrious mathematician Leonard Euler, whose own brilliance illuminated the European scientific community, could not conceal his incredulity. Upon learning of Sanchez's expulsion, he remarked, "I doubt whether amazing actions of this kind will contribute towards the reputation of the Russian Academy of Sciences." In this way, the empire's obsession with religious conformity crushed both commerce and intellect alike, leaving those who dared to preserve their Jewish identity under constant peril, while the machinery of the state relentlessly enforced the dictates of faith over reason and profit. The story now shifts to a new ruler, one whose name would be remembered for its ambition, its intelligence, and its deep fascination with the ideals of Western Europe. Empress Catherine II, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, had risen from a German princess to the throne of Russia through a dramatic coup. She was a woman of immense culture, a devoted admirer of Enlightenment thinkers, and a leader who imagined Russia as a modern empire shaped by reason. Yet even she, this enlightened Westerner, was trapped in the web of Russian tradition and the powerful forces of clerical influence. In the circles of the Russian government at the time, few were as ready as Catherine to condemn the cruel and irrational policies that had been directed against the Jews. These policies were not merely administrative decisions. They were rooted in a form of Byzantine clericalism, a fusion of church authority and imperial power that saw religious conformity as the heart of national identity. Catherine, who could read the works of Voltaire and Diderot in their original language, could clearly see how unjust and harmful such prejudices were. Yet, in the early years of her reign, she found herself unable to overturn a policy that had become sanctified by tradition. The ban on Jews was no longer simply a law. It was regarded as something national, something inherently Russian. Catherine's own rise to power had been tied to the overthrow of her husband, Peter III, a ruler who had favored Prussia and had been deeply unpopular with many factions in Russia. To justify her seizure of the throne, Catherine had to present herself as a defender of the Orthodox faith, a ruler in the lineage of her Russian predecessors. Her legitimacy depended upon it. We learn of this inner conflict from Catherine's own memoirs, where she writes of herself in the third person, a technique that distances her from the raw emotions of the moment. She describes a crucial event that took place just days after her accession. On the 5th or 6th day of her rule, she arrived at the Senate, the highest legislative body in the empire. On that very day, the Senate was debating the question of admitting Jews into Russia. The senators, the leading statesmen of the empire, were unanimous. They believed that allowing Jews to enter the country would be beneficial. But Catherine, still new to power and surrounded by a volatile climate, found it difficult to agree. She was still in the process of consolidating her authority. The memory of the violent overthrow of Peter III was fresh, and the nation was tense, its emotions raw. It was then that Senator Count Odayevsky rose to her aid. He suggested that before making a decision, she should look at a precedent. He asked to see the handwritten ruling of Empress Elizabeth, Catherine's predecessor, on a similar matter. When the documents were brought, Catherine saw Elizabeth's note written in the margin. "From the enemies of Christ, I desire neither gain nor profit." This pious remark revealed the deep religious fear that governed the minds of many powerful Russians. It was a fear that equated Jews not merely with difference, but with danger to the Christian faith itself. At this moment, less than a week after she had become empress, Catherine was under immense pressure. She had been placed on the throne as a protector of the Greek Orthodox faith. She was dealing with a deeply religious people and with a clergy whose power had been weakened by the earlier reforms. The clergy had not yet received back the lands and incomes that had been taken from them, and they were desperate. The nation was still reeling from the upheaval, and the people's emotions were volatile. To begin her reign by admitting Jews would have risked provoking a backlash. Yet to declare their admission harmful would have contradicted the liberal spirit that Catherine secretly admired. When the Procurator General, the chief legal official of the empire, gathered the votes and approached her for a decision, Catherine chose the path of delay. In this moment, the tension of the era becomes painfully clear. The economic necessity of Jewish trade collided with the political and religious fears of the empire. Little Russia's merchants and nobles understood the practical benefits of Jewish commerce, yet the central government, bound by tradition and the need to appease conservative forces, remained rigid. The story of Russia and its Jews thus continued, shaped by the clash between economic reality and ideological fear, between progress and prejudice, between the urgent needs of trade and the slow, heavy machinery of empire. The petition for relief and reconsideration of past inquisitorial edicts was firmly denied. Not even Catherine II, the empress of all the Russias, with her famed intelligence and reformist tendencies, dared to overturn the ruthless resolution issued by Empress Elizabeth Petrovna against what were officially declared the enemies of Christ. The shadow of that edict hung heavily over the Jewish population, a chilling reminder that in the eyes of the Russian state, deviation from Orthodox Christian belief was a crime punishable by the harshest means. It was under these oppressive conditions, a climate of fear, suspicion, and strict religious control, that a momentous event occurred, one that would alter the trajectory of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Beginning in the year 1772, the Russian Empire embarked on a dramatic expansion, absorbing territories that had once belonged to the disintegrating Kingdom of Poland. Poland, a nation long plagued by internal weakness, corruption, and foreign interference, could no longer maintain its independence, and Russia, along with neighboring powers, moved to seize its lands in a series of partitions that would shake the region for decades. This sudden annexation brought to Russian rule vast numbers of Jewish communities, populations that had been living for centuries under the relative protection of Polish law and tradition. What had previously been a matter of a few thousand Jews tolerated, or at least closely monitored, within the borders of the Russian Empire was now an overwhelming reality. Tens of thousands, and soon hundreds of thousands, of Jewish families and individuals were incorporated overnight into a state whose institutions had long been structured on suspicion, discrimination, and religious conformity. The Russian authorities now faced an unprecedented dilemma. On one hand, centuries of anti-Jewish tradition, suspicion of their religious practices, and fear of moral corruption fueled by deep-seated Muscovite superstition remained deeply ingrained in the bureaucracy, the courts, and the local populations. On the other hand, the empire now possessed a vast new population that was a vital part of European trade, culture, and social life, concentrated in towns and cities across the newly acquired Western provinces. These Jewish communities represented the largest center of the Jewish diaspora, carrying with them centuries of scholarship, commerce, and communal organization. The collision of these forces, the historical fear of the Jewish other, and the pressing practical necessity of governing and integrating a vast, culturally distinct population, created a tension that would dominate the policies of successive Russian rulers. The state, for all its autocratic might, was compelled to wrestle with this paradox: how to maintain its long-standing traditions of religious conformity and control while managing the sudden arrival of a vibrant and numerically significant population whose presence could not be ignored. It was a moment heavy with uncertainty and potential. On one side lay centuries of oppression, inquisitorial decrees, public executions, and social ostracism. On the other lay a new reality: vast numbers of human beings, families, and communities suddenly under imperial dominion, whose customs, beliefs, and livelihoods would challenge, strain, and ultimately shape the very fabric of the Russian state. The story of the Jewish people in Russia, and of Russia itself, was about to enter a new, turbulent, and profoundly consequential chapter. Footnotes. For listeners who wish to understand the references more clearly, it is helpful to know a few details. The events described earlier are expanded upon in the source text, particularly in the sections around pages 36 and 37. When Polotsk is mentioned, it should not be confused with the city of Plock in Polish territory, which at that time was the capital of its own administrative region in what was then Russian-controlled Poland, situated on the right bank of the Vistula River. Additional explanations of these events and policies begin around page 153 of the source, offering a fuller picture of the measures taken by the authorities. The word ukase, pronounced okz, with the emphasis on the final syllable, originally meant a simple instruction or order. In the Russian context, it came to refer to an official command issued directly by the Tsar or by the Senate acting on his behalf. At that time, Little Russia, roughly corresponding to present-day Ukraine, maintained its own military organization. This included regiments and smaller units called hundreds, led by officers native to the region. At the top of this hierarchy stood the commander-in-chief, known as the hetman, who wielded both military and administrative authority over the territory. Another term, resolution, in Russian called rezolutsia, referred to a decision personally written by the Tsar in the margins of reports that were submitted to him, marking the Tsar's direct involvement in governance. Further context and discussion of these measures can be found in the source on page 253, Note 1. Chapter 8 carries us deeper into the turbulent and often perilous existence of Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, a period when the empire's expansion and internal consolidation brought new challenges and dangers. This chapter explores the intricate dynamics between the state, its officials, and Jewish populations, showing how imperial policies were applied with a mix of suspicion, fear, and sporadic pragmatism. It illuminates the ways in which Jews navigated restrictions on trade, residence, and religious practice, often finding themselves caught between local authorities, hostile neighbors, and the sweeping edicts of the Tsar or Tsarina. The narrative anticipates moments of dramatic conflict, expulsions enforced with cold precision, attempts at forced conversions, and the precarious lives of those living in border provinces where imperial oversight was inconsistent but always looming. At the same time, it hints at resilience, adaptation, and the subtle ways Jewish communities sought to preserve their faith, commerce, and traditions under immense pressure. Listeners are invited to witness a world in which survival depended on vigilance, strategy, and courage, and where every imperial decree carried the potential to reshape entire communities overnight. Chapter 8 carries us deeper into the turbulent and often perilous existence of Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, a period when the empire's expansion and internal consolidation brought new challenges and dangers. This chapter explores the intricate dynamics between the state, its officials, and Jewish populations, showing how imperial policies were applied with a mix of suspicion, fear, and sporadic pragmatism. It illuminates the ways in which Jews navigated restrictions on trade, residence, and religious practice, often finding themselves caught between local authorities, hostile neighbors, and the sweeping edicts of the Tsar or Tsarina. The narrative anticipates moments of dramatic conflict, expulsions enforced with cold precision, attempts at forced conversions, and the precarious lives of those living in border provinces where imperial oversight was inconsistent but always looming. At the same time, it hints at resilience, adaptation, and the subtle ways Jewish communities sought to preserve their faith, commerce, and traditions under immense pressure. Listeners are invited to witness a world in which survival depended on vigilance, strategy, and courage, and where every imperial decree carried the potential to reshape entire communities overnight. Thank you for listening. If you have not done so already, please give a like and subscribe. You are welcome to leave your own point of view, as I may not know everything. By sharing your thoughts, you may help teach someone else along the way.
Up to this point, Dubnow has traced the growth of Jewish life in Poland-Lithuania, highlighting the development of strong communal institutions, economic roles, and a distinctive spiritual and social culture shaped by relative autonomy and recurring crises. Chapter 7, in particular, shows a society already under strain, facing political decline, social tension, and the weakening of the state that had long provided the framework for Jewish existence. Chapter 8 marks a decisive turning point. With the partitions of Poland, this familiar world collapses, and vast Jewish populations are drawn into new imperial systems, especially that of Russia. Dubnow presents this moment as a historical rupture, where old structures are dismantled and new realities imposed, making Chapter 8 essential for understanding the transition from Polish Jewish autonomy to the conditions that would define Jewish life in the Russian Empire. What has been described so far is a world already trembling on the edge of collapse. The Jewish communities of the Polish-Lithuanian